Hi, class. I just want to do a quick review of Goose Girl and then kind of introduce your assignment for next week, but I'll write that in the announcements as well. So yeah, I think you guys did a pretty good job with Freud. One thing you might have added with the Freud, because remember, Freud's whole thing is id and superego are at battle with each other to compromise with one another and produce the ego, right? So a lot of you found id representations in that story. Maybe the princess's um, um, attraction or non-attraction to Conrad, or sort of sexual desire as it's seen there, but also maybe the id desires of the maid to take over and things like that. So those would be examples of unconscious desires that society doesn't permit, right? So jealousy might be permitted amongst royals, but not amongst the plebes, right? Not amongst all the commoners. And so we could see that as examples of ids that are reshaped in some cases by pure force, what happens to the maid, right? Or in other cases, such as what happens with the princess. We might also look at her willingness to go along with the changing of the clothes, etc., of the maidservants at the maidservants' insistence, as also an example of an id that maybe she just doesn't like the pressures of this royal world, especially the gender pressures that go with it, and is fine with letting someone else kind of take over and becoming one of the commoners, so to speak, right? And so it might speak in that sense to a subaltern, right? In this case, though, she ends up finally adhering to the voice of the superego. And so, what I want to do in this case, the superego would be represented either both as the mom and also as Falala, the horse, whose mom's voice, so to speak, right? And so we could go even further to say the superego in this case is reified as nature itself. This is not a socially constructed voice that the princess is given, but the story seems to try to argue that it's really from nature, from the gods, that this natural order of things exists, right? So don't try to challenge it like the maidservant does, because then you're challenging the gods, you're challenging nature itself. So stay in your lane, so to speak. And a lot of you picked up on that message, I think, in terms of the cultural hegemony. I thought you did a really good job on that. Some of you kind of left out your own interpretations, and I would like you to do a little more in that. So you make sure we're using these other theorists as lenses to reinforce or support our interpretations and not letting them speak for us, right? So what I really wanted to focus on um, was Jung and to do his sort of archetypal analysis. I think that will also help with Freud a little bit. One thing many of you didn't bring in, or you brought, as I mentioned, a lot of you brought up the id, but not much on the superego, which again would be the voice of the mom, the queen, and all the voices through Falala and others. Therein, as well as the voice later on of the king and royalty, which is consistent with mom's voice. They kind of want the same thing. They want her to become the princess in this new kingdom and soon to be the queen, etc. Right? To fulfill her role both in terms of gender and in terms of class. Right? But I want to take the Jungian analysis to kind of point out how it's a little different. So Freud then is going to, how it's a little different from Freud, because Freud then would argue that this is a story that functions like dreams do to help us to repress and suppress those id desires. Certainly we can see how jealousy of people of higher status would be repressed and smothered by listening to this story, right? And so that's the function of myth for Freud. But for Jung, the function is individuation, is reconciling and assimilating all of those different archetypal forces into one centered self, right? So I want to focus on his primary 5 archetypes, and those are the persona, and the persona is kind of the mask that society wears, and so the voice of society and the mask of society. And that's kind of a fancy word for the superego, and I think it really does work as a superego. So the persona archetype in this story would be the mother, Falala, and there can be multiple archetypes in a single story for the same archetype, multiple figures representing the same archetype, the same force, right? And I think that's what we have here. So we've got that, right? And that's archetype number one, persona, which is mother Falala. Archetype number two, the dominant ones of the five Jung focuses on, is ego. And again, we're just the same as Freud here. The ego is the actual self, as it is being introduced into, not the ideal self, right? Which is the voice of the persona, but the self as it actually is. So that's the protagonist of the story. That's our princess, all right? And then the two really important ones are the shadow and in this case, it's the animus. If it's a male protagonist, then it's an anima, which would represent the opposite sex force that needs to be integrated and assimilated in order to achieve individuation, right? And then finally the shadow, which is this force that we um, push away from us because we think of it as evil. And in Jungian terminology, in Jungian practice, we shouldn't push those things away. We need to invite the darkness in and assimilate it and control it in some way, right? To become a healthy, functioning adult, right? So it's all about individuation. So I think the shadow in this story is pretty easy to find. It's going to be that maid servant. Um, and that maid servant who comes to her as this force of doing what she wants. It goes against the will of the ego in this case, right? It seems to be in opposition until it's, of course, tamed later on in the story. So the story seems to suggest that this shadow, because the princess hasn't integrated it, that Jung would argue, because she hasn't integrated it, the shadow is controlling her, right? So until we assimilate and come to terms with the darkness, it will control us if we're using Jungian psychology. And so that would be what happens to her early on in the story. So the other thing would be the animus. In this case, it would be Conrad and the sexual attention. You probably read the Freudian idea that hair is a symbol of sexual attraction, and how he wanted a piece of her hair as a symbol for him wanting to have sexual relations with her, etc. Right? And so, and especially when we add on this class element that the postmodernists would add on, we see how she has not integrated those forces, right? And so, by the end of the story, however, when the oven makes her talk, the oven can be seen as a womb, which is again the voice of the mother, but also the voice of the king, because it's the king that puts her in the stove that makes her talk and tell the truth, right? Um, and so it's that instrument that helps her to assimilate those forces, come to terms with them, and accept them, right? And that means accepting her sexuality and accepting that darkness in this case, which is maybe her gender and other things, right? And so once she's accepted those things, once she's integrated and assimilated those two archetypes in particular, then she's able to listen to the persona archetype and assimilate that as well. So the whole story in a Jungian analysis is the goose girl pushing away both her mother and the persona archetype, and her sexual desires, symbolized by Conrad, as well as the maid and those kind of the freedom that might be represented by someone going outside of their class and not doing what they're supposed to do, etc. Once she integrates all those things, now the ego is transformed, and the symbol for this is often a wedding, and that's kind of the case here. It's her meeting the prince, and now her sexual desires are funneled correctly. So we see sublimation in a Freudian sense. She doesn't have to repress those sexual desires now that she may have had for Conrad, because now she can express them in a socially appropriate way through marriage to a prince, right? And also those dark forces that may have been a subaltern energy that are attacking, she's assimilated those. And so through marriage now, she has become a self in Jungian terminology, right? So that's the Jungian idea of this. Hillman would say, no, we don't want to individuate. We should grow and expand, see archetypes as mirrors to ourselves. And so that's a different way of reading myth. So Hillman and other postmodernists would see these challenging archetypes as potentialities for growth, right? That she can see a side of herself through Conrad and the side of herself through this maid that then she can bring to a relationship with the prince, say, right? So it would be a completely different reading through Hillman. And then, of course, the postmodern analysis, I think you all did a great job pointing out what's obviously there, which the primary message is stay in your lane, right? And we see reification. Remember, reification is when socially constructed conditions are presented as natural and inevitable and unchangeable, right? And that's kind of what this story does. It says, it's nature that intervenes to prevent Conrad from having his way with the Goose Girl, right? It's this magical stove, or iron oven rather, that she's put in, symbolizing a womb and a rebirth, so to speak. That that signal the truth of what's happening, showing that, hey, you can never get away with this sort of imposterism, because it's the natural order is that hierarchy of medieval times, of an aristocracy, and then the lords, etc., and below that, and so on. So it's upholding that hierarchy, upholding that very strict class structure of society, but saying, no, it's not human ordered, right? It's not human created. This is ordained and predetermined by the gods and by nature itself, right? So I think that's the primary message it's sending. So that's a good example of how we can see how myth functions as propaganda. And the gender one that you guys pointed out is there as well. And there we might see a subaltern, as I mentioned, as it might be that, she goes along so willingly with this maidservant because maybe she's just not very pleased with her gender roles in particular within, even though she's up the upper crust, she's still female, and that still places certain restrictions on her behavior and so on, right? And so her willingness and desire to be free of those behavioral expectations might be represented by her unwillingness to go along. Notice she never says that. That's why it's a subaltern. If she said, I don't want all these rules and orders of, and I don't want to conform to all these expected behaviors of a woman or even of royalty. I want to be free of all that. Then it wouldn't be subaltern. Then it would be her expressing her needs and interests. Subaltern is just her just kind of going along with things. She doesn't have a voice. Her voice can't be even articulated in her own mind. The cops in her head would undermine those voices already. But we can see how those, as Spivak puts it, while the subaltern doesn't have a voice, it still shapes history. And we could maybe see this as an example of how it shapes her behavior, even as there is no exact voice to it. Okay, so this week we're going to focus on Gilgamesh. I'm in the story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So make sure you've read that. That was due this week anyway, so I'm sure you have, because you're all great students, right? So if you need to refresh your memories or whatever, do so. But I'm going to have you do something similar, except rather than you focusing on the theorist, we're just going to go straight into interpreting what kind of hero Gilgamesh is, and I'm going to assign each of you different arguments to support. So it may not be the argument you would really make, but you'll get a chance to make that as well. But we're going to kind of have a debate. So I'm going to give three different groups, three different viewpoints about how to interpret Gilgamesh, about how to interpret the status of women in that culture. And then we're going to kind of debate that via the discussion tab. And then at the end of that, I'll have you respond with your own views about what's going on in Gilgamesh in terms of heroic ideals, or the ideal. Remember, a hero is an ideal male, and in a male dominant culture, that often means the ideals that a human should have, right? And so it's the ideals and values of that culture. So we'll take a look at Gilgamesh and see and compare it to heroes of our own times to see if Gilgamesh would fit right in, or whether he's an anti-hero, or whether he's kind of a mix of both, maybe. Okay. And then we'll look at the role of females, the status of females in that story, and say, okay, Do women have it better today in terms of status, not in terms of living conditions and stuff, but in terms of status compared to men? Or did they have it better back then? And both of you, both, I'll give different groups to look for evidence in support of both of those claims. And we'll kind of pluck from the text to make our arguments. But again, I'll put that in the announcements tab. And as always, shoot me an email if you need, if you have any questions. And if we need to talk by phone, just give me your phone number and we'll chat that way. So hope you're all hanging in there and having a good semester so far. And talk to you soon. Bye.